My name is Jim Krause, and I'm Principal Investigator of the Center for Health Outcomes among Underserved Populations. And I'm going to do a little presentation mostly for a professional audience today, and it's on earnings and spinal cord injury. And this is funded by the National Institute for Disability and Rehabilitation Research. I'm going to take you through several slides, the first of which is on earnings. And so I want to talk about three types of factors that go into post-injury earnings. The first is simply return to work. There's a differential probability of going back to work. Some people go back, some people do not. Conditional earnings is the amount of earnings among people that do go back to work. So we have looked at predictive equations of earnings among those who go back to work, and then we look at prediction of unconditional earnings. And unconditional earnings are when we classify people who do not go back to work as zero earnings, and then look at the actual earnings of those who do go back to work. What we have here in gold are all the factors that are significantly related to the probability of return to employment, or actually, more accurately, current employment status after SCI. And all these factors are very widely known, and they are why we selected them for the study. But they include gender, with males having a greater likelihood of return to work. Race, we see a greater likelihood of non-African Americans. We see a greater likelihood as a function of injury severity, with people who are less severely injured having more difficulty returning to work. People who are ambulatory have a greater likelihood of return to work, and people with higher educations have a greater likelihood of return to work. And now we'll look at conditional earnings. And what is interesting here is, even though there are some significant disadvantages in the likelihood of returning to work for a number of groups, they don't all carry over into earnings, but some very important ones do. And so again, if we look at the gold, we have the differences that are statistically significant are gender, race, ethnicity, and education. And in the first study, the actual dollar value differences in conditional earnings as a function of gender are just under $16,000, which means among those that go back to work after SCI, the average earnings differences favor men by almost $16,000. For race, we grouped all African Americans together and non-African Americans in a second group. There were very few non-Caucasians in that group, but essentially African Americans made on average $19,000 less among those who returned to work. By far the largest factor was having a college degree, and among those who returned to work, those with a college degree earned over $35,000 more. What is also interesting, but not statistically significant, is that we had two injury severity variables, one for neurologic level of injury and one for ambulatory status. And whereas people who had less severe injuries according to neurologic level and ambulatory status were more likely to return to work, they were no more likely to make more money if they returned to work. Any differences were not statistically significant. And this simply is a graphic depiction of what we have just said, and these are conditional earnings. You can see the very large bump for people with college at the end of the graph, and at the beginning of the graph you can see the differences as a function of gender and race, ethnicity. And what again I would point out is those are the only three things that were statistically significant. Now this is the second part of the model, and this accounts for the combination of employment status and conditional earnings. So this is unconditional earnings. And again, we put dollar values for all people that fall in these groups, regardless of whether they go back to work. So it's a summary of earnings, including those who are unemployed, that are attributed $0. And again, you'll see more statistically significant findings, but again, the dollars change somewhat. And then for unconditional earnings, this is the last graph I'll show. You can see the differences, again, on the extremes, the most important factors, again, being a college degree and differences as a function of gender or race. Now, the important thing to really think about within this analysis is that even among those who go back to work, You already have a disadvantage for African Americans in terms of a smaller percentage going back to work. You have smaller percentages of individuals with certain characteristics in terms of education, lower education levels. They have less of a chance to go back to work. But if they go back to work, that disadvantage is magnified. It's magnified for women, African Americans, and those with the least education. And interesting enough, if you can get people back to work with a severe spinal cord injury, their earnings are likely to be very similar to those who do not have as severe of injuries. Thank you.